Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Body Wisdom Podcast, where we discussed the mind-body connection. My name is Tami Bulmash, and I'm thrilled to have Tim Soar join us back today for our next podcast, Sonnets and Singing with the Alexander Technique. Tim Soar grew up in London, but has lived in Wales for many years. He began his career as a musical instrument maker, and his interests as a musician and an Aikido practitioner led him to the Alexander Technique. He qualified as a STAT teaching member in 1993. Since 1995, Tim has taught the Alexander Technique at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama, the National Conservatoire of Wales. In addition to his home practice, Tim maintains visiting teaching practices in London and Aalborg, Denmark. A recent development is a collaborative project to offer residential courses focusing on yoga and the Alexander Technique. Hi, Tim, and welcome back to our show.
Hi, thank you for having me back, and it's a great pleasure to be here.
It is wonderful. I'm so thrilled to have you back, and I'm really excited about this topic today because I think it's going to speak to a lot of vocalists, musicians, singers, and just people who are curious about how to use their voice more efficiently. And I wanted to ask you, Tim, you've been working with performers for over 25 years, and most notably at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama since 1995. And what drew you to want to work with performers?
Well, I was lucky to have the opportunity to start teaching at the Royal Welsh just a couple of years after I qualified. And I guess I kind of cut my teeth there as a young Alexander teacher, building my skills. And that's led more recently to the work in my London practice, where a significant proportion of the work is with professional musicians. The Alexander Technique's an extraordinary way of working with musicians. And to me, the magic of it is that if you help a musician to coordinate themselves better from an Alexander Technique point of view, then almost invariably their sound improves. There was a cellist who I taught recently right through her 4-year degree course. And often when we changed something in the way she was coordinating herself, often actually away from the cello, and then we go back to playing music, she'd sometimes say, "Oh, my cello loves that." Because part of how she sensed the difference, the change that we'd made, was that the instrument itself just seemed to sing and to resonate more freely. And that relationship between Alexander work and musical sound quality seems to work with really any acoustic instrument, but not surprisingly, that effect is most pronounced and most immediate with a singer. So although I made the decision when I was still a teenager, I think that the life of a professional musician was not for me. Music has always been a sort of first love and a central pillar of my life, and I feel really fortunate that I've found ways of working on the periphery of the music profession in roles that suit my skills and my personality much better than as an actual performer.
Oh, that's lovely. I'm sure your students are very fortunate to have you with your background and experience. And in addition to your work as an Alexander Technique teacher and a musician, I recently discovered that you also perform sonnets beautifully. And I wanted to know, how did you come about this desire to want to perform sonnets and your interest in sonnets in the first place?
Well, I'm certainly not in any sense a Shakespearean expert, but I've always loved the plays, and I've always taken the opportunity to, see the big British Shakespeare companies in Stratford or in London. And the sonnets in particular seem to me to be constructed so perfectly and on such a small scale. The craftsmanship of them seems kind of almost miraculous. And I find that combination of care and skill a very attractive and important quality. And I guess anybody whose work involves kind of skill and precision, and of course I'm kind of thinking the Alexander technique, but it would apply to a lot of other professions as well. Yeah. I think it's that level of skill and detail is something to kind of aspire to in whatever field. So when lockdown came back in March, I wanted a way of, well, sort of counting the days, marking the days. And from March the 20th to September the 7th, this year, I had 171 days of not teaching. And I recorded and I posted on Facebook one sonnet every day for 154 of those days.
It's incredible. It is incredible.
And funnily enough, Patrick Stewart did the same project at the same time, which was quite fun.
Patrick Stewart from Star Trek.
Exactly. Yeah.
I adore him.
And so sometimes he was sometimes a few days ahead of me, and I'd kind of go and sneak on his and go, how did he do that one?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. It's just amazing that you and Patrick Stewart were kind of working in parallel to each other with the sonnet. So great minds think alike, I suppose. I would like to take this moment and take a look at your sonnet, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When most I wink, then do mine eyes best see. For all the day they view things unrespected. But when I sleep, in dreams they look on thee, and darkly bright are bright in dark directed. Then thou, whose shadow shadows doth make bright, how would thy shadows form happy show to the clear day, with thy much clearer light, when to unseeing eyes thy shade shines so? How would, I say, mine eyes be blessed made by looking on thee in the living day, when in dead night thy fair imperfect shade through heavy sleep on sightless eyes doth stay. All days are nights to see till I see thee, and nights bright days when dreams do show thee me.
It was just incredible. I loved listening to you read the sonnet. It sounds so poetic and melodic, and it's just, as someone who studied theater in London, I can really appreciate how much work goes into something like that, because for someone who's listening for the first time, it might just sound like a British person reading really well, but they don't understand how much vocal work and diction, enunciation, just the iambic pentameter of anything Shakespearean for that matter. And you do it so effortlessly, you do it so beautifully. And it's just absolute joy to listen to. So I wanted to ask you, because Shakespeare's work is so meticulous, how do you apply the principles of the Alexander technique to your sonnet performances?
Well, I guess to start with, the project was an extraordinary opportunity to go right back to the beginning of the Alexander technique. which of course began with Alexander's own problems and questions around exactly this process of recitation. I think that particularly because of the small scale of the sonnets, they really need what you might call a steady hand. You need to be quiet enough and still enough in yourself that the delicacy of the writing is allowed to come through. And the Alexander technique certainly helps you find, and helps me certainly find, that inner quiet. And then there's the breathing, the paradox of what gets called breath control, which I think we might be going to talk about in a bit more detail in a minute. Sonnet 43, which was the one
Yes.
that you just heard me read, is actually a reasonably easy one from the point of view of the breath, because it's about dreaming, and the rhythm of the breaths has the regularity of sleep. And I found figuring out that rhythm of the breaths in each of the sonnet was fundamental to making them work, because the different breath rhythms are actually part of Shakespeare's deliberate structure for each sonnet, and part of how he tells the story for each sonnet. The connection, I mean, maybe for people who are less familiar with the Alexander technique, the connection there is that Alexander was known as the breathing man, because he really figured out how we can work towards improving and working with our breathing, not least in voice work. One of the principles I try to follow is that all the sound you hear is the actual words, or in music, all the sound you hear is the musical sounds. So there's nothing extra, ideally. And I think that idea of nothing extra is very central to the Alexander technique.
Yes.
in kind of all interpretations of nothing extra. And particularly in this case, the nothing extra is that there's no breath sound, either in terms of what Alexander referred to as sniffing and gasping on the in-breath, or of breathiness in the spoken or the sung sound of the out-breath.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, it's just joy, and I think that the Alexander technique is so appealing to so many performers for that reason. They don't realize why they're coming to the Alexander technique and what happens, but I often think that it's a completely different experience than what they anticipated. So,
well, there's nothing really prepares you for it, I think.
Right.
When it's working well, it's so extraordinary.
Right. Well, they come in there thinking they're working on their voice or whatever they think their breath, and then they come out of there, completely a different person, looking at life from a different lens. So that's what I love about the technique. I wanted to talk to you, since you're someone I would consider very much an expert in this field with music, singing, vocal work. How would you explain what the difference is between classical singing and modern singing?
I think it's quite a complex question, actually. And there is an easy one-word answer, which is amplification. But I'm going to give a slightly longer answer than that. To start with, of course, it's worth saying that there's a lot of overlap. And I've worked with opera-trained people who've been doing musical theatre, or they've been doing stage shows where they've been, still opera-trained people, but they're standing at the front of the stage singing to a microphone. I've also worked with one remarkable vocalist who'd been through a conservatoire training, but she was doing quite incredible things with her voice that if you tried to categorize them, you'd say they were more coming from world music. So, you know, she was experimenting with belting and with yodeling and harmonic singing. And she was working with the Royal Shakespeare Company as part of a small group of musicians and sound effects artists, creating avant-garde soundtracks, which they were performing live for Shakespearean theatre productions. So I think at its best, everything sort of swirls into everything else, and the seemingly easy classification of, you know, well, what's classical singing, what's modern singing,
Right.
it kind of becomes an impossible question. So I'm going to say something beyond that about maybe the longer history rather than just the 20th and 21st century history of singing, and actually to go way back in time to the evolutionary origins of singing. I think that's interesting to me, because it seems to me that we're evolved to sing. And what I mean by that is that singing involves the complete utilization of the vocal process in a way that speaking doesn't. So you have to say, well, this process, the mechanisms that we're equipped with are kind of built for singing. And it seems likely that the origin of that is in long range communication, something you might refer to as calling. And that has obvious evolutionary and social advantages. And we've probably been doing that since even before we had language. So once you have a means of long distance calling, then you start to see traditional cultures and societies all around the world taking this calling ability and developing it into art music of a kind that, of course, is particular to their culture. So things like Mongolian throat singing or alpine yodeling or African calling and drumming seem to be examples of that have survived to the present day. And the African rhythms particularly have kind of poked through into our modern Western experience in the form of the African Caribbean, African Cuban dance rhythms. So whilst we might think of salsa as modern music, actually it's got old roots. And to me, there's something very visceral in our response to the unamplified voice as it relates to this ancient calling use of the voice. There's something in us that responds to that. And I find that particularly rewarding to work with and to kind of keep in my mind when I'm working with singers. So what happens when I'm working with a singer in an Alexander lesson is that we'll often be making quite detailed, subtle changes in the way they're coordinating themselves. But it's kind of like picking a lock, because when you find the coordinational key to unlocking something in their voice, it's like a tiny change that makes a whole world of difference. And often the way I know it's worked is that all the hair on my scalp and all the hair down my spine kind of stands up. And the way their voice reaches me is suddenly a genuine physical thrill. And I think that's very much part of how I understand the Alexander technique. It's kind of characteristic of how I understand the Alexander technique, that we seem to work in a very detailed and technical way, but the ultimate value of it is that that's a way of unlocking this very visceral whole self experience and response.
It's a beautiful way of explaining it. You know, I always thought of singing very much like the birds, you know, like our own call, like it's our own personal sound.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but I love how you explained and tied it into actually modern singing is comprised of sound historically, every kind of sound. You know, you can have even Mozart is used in like techno music now and all these sorts of things. So there is a bridge. But so when you have singers come to you for like say their voice teacher says, you know, you should really do some Alexander technique lessons, and they have no idea why, and so they come to you for a first lesson. What do you do with them in a first Alexander technique lesson?
Well, I do work. I do enjoy working in lessons with musicians and singers while they're actually making music. But pretty much invariably, I do the first lesson or two away from that, and using the traditional Alexander procedures of working with the chair and working lying down. Some teachers would work more immediately in applying the Alexander technique directly to the activity that the student brings and what they want to do. But for me, I find the abstraction of the traditional procedures to be the clearest and the most powerful way of helping someone reorganize their coordination. It also helps to get them used to the absolutely unique form of hands-on work that Alexander teachers use as a way of, we kind of do it as a way of explaining things, I think. And also to get them used to the essentially experimental way that we work in the Alexander technique, where you're not pushing directly for a preconceived result, but that you're improving things by gradually coming to know the whole territory of your coordination better.
Oh, that's wonderful. I want to have a lesson with you one day, please.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. When we can get on the same continent,
yes,
we can manage that. That would be great.
It sounds fantastic. Sometimes I've had students that come to me after going to a voice teacher that tells them that they need to work on their breath. And I wanted you to share from your experience, how do you address that in a lesson with a student that only wants to focus on their breath?
I think in the Alexander technique, we have a very unusual way of working, not even with the breath, but towards breath. It's very, very indirect, but I think the justification of it is that actually what we're doing is entirely congruent with the modern physiological understanding of breathing. So I'll try and explain it. From a physiological or maybe neurological point of view, you might say that breathing is a bit like an iceberg. There's a bit you can see that you can get at that's above the surface, and there's a much larger proportion of that that's below the surface. And of course, the dangerous mistake that everyone seems to make with icebergs is that they imagine that the little bit that they can see is most of what there is. Wow. And I think many, many times people make the same mistake with considering breathing. If I come along and I tell you how to breathe, or somebody gives advice, this is what you do to breathe properly. Okay. And of course, we try to do that in a conscious sort of way. We try to carry out those instructions. But we can only do that trying to carry out instructions with the part of our neurology that sticks up above the surface where you can get at it, the tip of the iceberg. So in doing that, we're knocking out of play the influence of that much larger and actually much more important part of the process that is about as accessible to our conscious doing as maybe trying to control our heartbeat. It's kind of deep part of the nervous system. Mr. Alexander once said, if I breathe as I understand breathing, then I am doing something wrong. And sometimes these aphorisms of Alexander's that are a bit, they're like kind of Zen riddles, but actually he's talking about this iceberg thing.
Just got goosebumps. That's great. No, that's great. It's just phenomenal. Yes.
So from my point of view, the primary consideration with breathing is to work towards not doing anything which interferes with the workings of that larger but more hidden part of the process of breathing. So what we're aiming to do is to come to a point where we're consciously cooperating with the deeper parts of our nervous system, letting that larger part of the nervous system do its work for us in order not to be in conflict with ourselves. And by moving from self-conflict to self-cooperation, you get all your energy as a singer, perhaps in this case, but as a general principle, through that process, you get all of your energy concerted to go in the same direction. And that's how you find your strength, by not wasting energy pulling yourself in opposing directions simultaneously. And you can actually, I mean, the procedures of the Alexander technique are designed and they work to actually help us do that. So that's how I guess that's how I deal with that sort of problem or question.
That is fantastic. I really think that the way you phrased it is so lovely, moving from self-conflict to self-cooperation. That's great.
What it's all about.
It is. It's worded beautifully. So I would like to take this moment to share a beautiful, beautiful clip from one of your students, Jennifer Clark, who has a gorgeous, gorgeous singing voice. And she's amazing. And in this clip, she is singing Brrr, Chick, 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 which is the cricket's aria from The Adventures of Pinocchio, which was composed by Jonathan Dove and premiered in 2007. So let's take a look at this.
Tuck, tuck, you rotten bit of no good wood. Sweep the floor clean, like you should. Tuck, 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 tuck. Can't be bothered, not today. It's too boring. Let me play. That's what all the donkeys say. That's what all the donkeys say. You a real boy, ha 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 ha. You a real boy, ha 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 ha. What you are and what you'll stay. If you carry on this way, if you carry on this way, if you carry on this way, you'll fall on mad. Lazy, lying, idle, bad. Won't he mark my words, you'll be. Tuck, 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 tuck. Just laze, just love, just human linger. Just never lift a shiftless finger. Just me a block of very thick wood. Change your ways or you'll come to no good. Change your ways or you'll come to no good. Come to no good, come to no good.
That is just phenomenal.
It's
She's
amazing.
she makes it just sound so easy, and those notes are impossible. I mean, just it's incredible. And when I watch her, you know, as she's singing and I'm looking at her, her neck is free. She's doing this with a free neck, which
Yep.
is the hardest thing for so many performers, I think, because they want to reach those
It's the only way she can do it, actually. Those notes that are kind of above a top C, the only way she can do that is to free it.
Yes.
Which is part of the excitement of working with the technique with
Yeah.
with a singer like that.
It just must be so rewarding for both of you, for you and Jennifer, to have worked together and to get to this place, because I can tell you from my experience working with classical singers, it's a very big hurdle to get to the concept of understanding what a free neck even is, especially with singing, because so often they think that they have to tighten their neck to work harder to get to that note. And this is just joy. I mean, just listening to her sing like that, it's incredible. So I wanted to ask you, how were you and Jennifer able to work together to get to this place, both as a student and a teacher?
Well, I guess to start with, it's really important to say that as an Alexander teacher, I can only take a kind of tiny amount of the credit, but and of course it's a huge privilege working with people who have that kind of talent and dedication. But I think Jennifer's a really great example of a musician who's made the Alexander technique not just part of how she looks after herself so that she's healthy enough to sing, which I think a lot of musicians do, and I think that's fine. But Jennifer's one of the people I know who's gone the whole distance with the Alexander technique and made it an integral part of how she sings and what she sounds like. The Alexander technique is amazing in the way that it really can get you in a step-by-step way from at the beginning using the principles of the Alexander technique to make very simple movements or make very simple experiments to do with coordination, right through to exploring the outer reaches of the possibilities of human ability, not least like the coloratura soprano repertoire, which I think is one of the most amazing things that a human can do, in fact. As a system, the Alexander technique, as a system, you never ever get to the end of it. And it can take you as far as you want to go in refining a skill like singing. And in the long term of things, if people are around the technique for years and years, there's a kind of ongoing unlocking process going on. In order to sing, it was interesting what you were saying about people feeling that they have to make the effort. And actually, you do need to be quite strong to sing. And you need to be prepared to use that strength. But the problem, of course, is that in accessing that strength, you can end up stiffening and clenching and locking. And you can carry on that way, which would be a bit like a bodybuilder, where with a sort of more is more rather than less is more attitude, and you can kind of power through and you get a kind of very muscled way of singing. And some people do that and they're actually successful with it. But with the Alexander technique, you're aiming actually to unpick all that and to free the sound from that muscling through approach. And we're aiming, if you like, at the strength of the Shaolin monk rather than the strength of the bodybuilder. Mm-hmm. And that creates a very different way of singing. Actually, in a lesson, I have a kind of picture in my mind of how it sometimes feels to me when things are going well, and it illustrates something of how it feels to the teacher when the hands-on work is going well, which is something people often seem to ask about and they're curious about. Mm-hmm. About sort of how the hands-on work works and what it's like from the teacher's point of view. So my idea is that if I'm working with an opera singer who's in full flow, or if that's a good way of describing what they do, what it feels to me is it's as if I'm at the helm of some magnificent sailing ship, and there's all this organized power that's going on under my hands and which reaches me through my other senses as well. And just as if you're steering a ship, you're not the one, I'm not the one who's creating that power. But it's my job to tune myself into how the ship is working and to sense what it needs, and to make the little adjustments to kind of trim a sail here or to tighten or loosen a rope there, and to kind of catch all the wind I can in the sails, and to make sure that all the energy gets converted into useful result. And I think that doing that with an opera singer, actually hands-on in a lesson, is about the most exciting thing I get to do really in my work.
It just sounds magical. I mean, you're part of the magic, you know, and I thought that your analogy with sailing, it's just so fantastic. It's a beautiful image to kind of think about what the work is about, and how it's a tool, and we get to facilitate that in our work. And the students are, I do agree that it's you're only as good as your student, so to speak, when your student wants to work with you. So, but I do think it's a joint effort. I know this from my own teacher, the very first teacher I worked with. She was able to take me on that ship. She was able to steer me, and I that's what brought me and to wanting to make this part of my life, this wonderful technique. So Tim, thank you so much for that. And I appreciate so much you coming here and joining us again in our second podcast together. I look forward to our next one. And is there anything you'd like to add, any last bits?
Only that it's been a pleasure as ever, and I hope to see you again.
Me too. Thank you so much, Tim.